Hey there, fellow travelers, fellow Tolk folk, fellow Tolkienites. How we doing today? So, some of you all have asked me to expand on my last video. Have asked for clarification on what ideologies exactly I'm talking about. When I mentioned Orcish ideologies, ideologies coming from Mordor, those sorts of things. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I want to start with this quote from the Silmarillion. Yet this is held true by the wise of Eressëa, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor ere Utumno was broken were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orcs in envy and mockery of the Elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor and the most hateful to Ilúvatar. So that's from the Silmarillion Chapter 3. So that quote obviously speaks of where the orcs came from, right? The orcs were a were essentially elves that were captured by Melkor and were corrupted. We don't know a lot of the specifics about how that happened, but it's kind of a crazy thing to think about, right? We think about orcs and we think about, there's these like despicable, strange creatures that just seem purely evil. But in terms of the legendarium, they are actually corrupted elves, or at least descended from corrupted elves. Um, and that should tell us something. That's we need to couch when we talk about Orcish ideologies. We need to couch that, and I intend to couch that at least in those terms, because I think that what Tolkien was describing there was one of the things that he was most concerned about when it came to uh, the manipulation of art. There's this theme within the legendarium of Middle Earth, a very strong theme of subcreation, of the role of elves and of men being to take the raw material of the world and to fashion it and to develop it into a more beautiful version of what it began as, right? It's an upward positive good and goal that Ilúvatar seems to have created elves and men for. And I'd even say the Valar as well, right? The Ainur as well. So that being said, there's a uh, there's a bad process that happens in all of that, and that is the one that is initiated by Melkor. It's the taking of something that's intended for good and doing kind of this negative subcreation, this fashioning of something into a mockery of what it's intended to be. And we see here that Tolkien calls that in the Silmarillion. He calls that when it comes to the elves and being transformed into the orcs, that it was the vilest deed of Melkor, that it may have been the vilest deed of Melkor and the most hateful to Ilúvatar. That's what I'm speaking of when I speak of orcish ideologies. I'm speaking of these attitudes, ideologies that want to take what Tolkien did in the works of Middle Earth and transform it into something that it's not. Now, Tolkien gave us a lot of information about what Middle Earth, the Middle Earth Legendarium, about what Lord of the Rings, all these things, about what they are. I've made other videos on those topics, but of course, it's also in some sense it's an open-ended question because we don't have Tolkien here to clarify things for us. So we only have the things that he's written and that we actually have available to us to talk about this. But those are the kinds of places that I believe we should start when it comes to talking about what the Rings of Power should be, what any adaptations, further adaptations of Tolkien's work should be. Um, I think we owe that to the person who created it. And I don't see how you can be true to what was created unless you hew close to that line. Um, so, in that sense, I have a positive mind when it comes to further adaptation. I do believe it's possible, and I would love to see good adaptations of the Legendarium of Middle Earth, but not at the expense of the soul of Middle Earth. And that's, I think, where a lot of people are coming from, right? A lot of people are kind of struggling with the things they see coming from the Rings of Power and thinking, are they just going to turn this into something that matches various ideologies that are more prominent these days? My biggest guiding principle when it comes to how I'm going to evaluate the success of the Rings of Power, the creative success of the Rings of Power, is just a simple question: what would Tolkien think? I'm going to look at different things he said about different issues and say, would he have approved of this? Would he have wanted it this way? Is this how he would have told the story? In that regard, what I've said a couple of times now is that I think the worst thing I've seen so far, the biggest violation, is the flattening of the timeline. It's really hard to get more egregious than that, because you're taking something that Tolkien explicitly said. There's no controversy about it. He explicitly said this is a 3,000 year period, and you're going to flatten it into a timeline. And why? Because it's not efficient. That's the reasons being given. We just can't do it. You see, we'd have to like have different man characters every season if we did that. And it's like, well, then tell that story. That's the story Tolkien told, so why can't you tell that story? You would have characters that would carry over, obviously, but you choose not to. To me, that's ideological imposition. I mean, that's the biggest one I see right now. It's this, like, I'm not exactly sure what that's called. It's like might makes rightism. We have the rights to do this, so we're going to do it. I might just call it the fascism of efficiency, which is weird to me, because you think if you have $500 million to spend to make this thing that you wouldn't be super worried about efficiency, but I guess they are. They want to turn a profit. So it's this idea of just this fascism of efficiency that, hey, we own the rights. So, I know it's 3,000 years, but it's not efficient to do it in 3,000, to do a 3,000 year time period. So we're just not going to do that. I can see plenty of ways in which you could accomplish that, quite frankly. And I've spoken about that, but you choose to do this. Initially, before they even announced it was going to be the story of the Second Age, they talked that it was going to be a story about basically like the adventures of Aragorn between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And, at the time I was kind of like, it doesn't sound very interesting. Now I look at it and I'm like, that actually might have been kind of cool, right? And maybe even doable. I look at what we're going to get in the War of the Rohirrim, and I'm like, okay, that's an example of like adapting story, telling new stories within the Legendarium that I'm actually kind of up on. But I almost feel like Amazon bit off more than it could chew before it realized what it did, and then said, well, I guess we'll have to flatten the timeline. That is ideological imposition. That kind of strikes at the two things at the two things I'm most concerned about: gross violations of the Legendarium and ideological imposition. That hits both, and that's why, to me, that's the worst of them all. Tolkien dealt with impositions from other ideologies throughout his life, right? The biggest one I've actually made a video about, or like maybe the original. I don't know if it's the biggest one, but it's the original one. And that was when the Nazis basically said, hey, if you want to publish The Hobbit, we need to know, in Germany, we need to know if you have any Jewish blood. And of course, Tolkien wasn't going with that, right? He was just like, well, okay, first of all, if I did have any Jewish blood, I would be honored to have Jewish. Like, he was like, he just basically gave him the big old middle finger, and he was like, you guys, I'm not going to kowtow to your ideology. So if you want to publish my book, go ahead. But I'm not gonna deal with it. And another thing that makes me love Tolkien so much, right? He was not for that kind of like just the anti-Semitism that the Nazis were putting forward. So that was an example where he dealt with this sort of ideological imposition in his own time, coming up against his works. But as far as other ideologies that we might be talking about, I don't know until I see them. I haven't seen much. None of us have seen much yet, right? They come in so many different shapes and sizes. They're all kind of these like, cute little creatures. I will say that I would say like anti-Christian or materialist ideologies that I see imposed. I think those will be more subtle ways, but we need to remember that Tolkien himself said the story of Numenor, the story of Lord of the Rings, was in fact about God's sole right to divine honor, right? That's something that's coming from his letters. That's him looking back and saying, hey, what's the main theme? And so Tolkien spoke about certain themes. When we see those in there, that's great. When we see those violated either by sins of commission or sins of omission, then that's going to be something I'll call out. Um, so if there's this kind of effort to pretend like Numenor doesn't have a religion, that it doesn't have this cult of the Minotaur, then I'm going to call that out big time. So it can come in forms of both sins of commission and sins of omission. As regard to the biggest things that I see other people talking about as violations, the two biggest things I see are the issue of Black Elves and then the issue of Warrior Galadriel. I think the issue of Black Elves is that it's like people complain that it's um, a I guess it's a violation of the canon because because it's the Middle Earth. The Middle Earth legendarium began as this like Northern European mythology, and so there wouldn't be any black characters or at least black elves. Um, I get where this argument is coming from, but I don't think it's accurate, and I don't think, and not in the sense that it began as this European mythology, but I just don't think that I don't think there's strong evidence that Tolkien would have said no to black elves. I think it all depends on how there are black elves, right? I think if you try to, so for example, let's say for example, they had tried to make, they had been, there'd been this diversity thing with Amazon where they're like, well, we need more black characters, so let's just go ahead and make Galadriel black, right? Um, that would have been a like an ideological imposition. That would have been a gross violation of the legendarium at the same time, right? Because it says that Galadriel had she was fair and that she had golden hair, right? It's pretty clear from the text that that's what it was. So when I see violations like that are violations of clearly things that Tolkien himself wrote and had in mind, then that's where it becomes a problem. Um, so, but in the case of the black elf that we know about, um, being in the Rings of Power, I think it all depends on what we learn about the origin of that elf, right? What is the story? Does it actually fit in with the, with the legendarium that Tolkien created? So, there's kind of subtle distinctions that have to be made. So with regards to that one, I'm absolutely open to the idea of black elves. It's just how do they bring them into the story? Do they connect it into the legendarium in a way that gels with what Tolkien actually wrote? And I just don't know enough yet to know if that is actually the case. I'll be happy to address that when it comes up. As regards Warrior Galadriel, I think there's some people that say, well, this is this sort of like, hyperfeminism or something like that that wants to make her out to be this like great warrior and adventurer and focus of the story. Um, Reading through the Silmarillion again lately, and reading other things like the chapter on Galadriel and Celeborn from Unfinished Tales, I actually think Tolkien would have been perfectly fine with this. I think as he went on in life, he thought that Galadriel was just like this amazing character, and that he had kind of discovered. Certainly, Galadriel, especially when she was younger, was a warrior. She was, I mean, she was pretty amazing. So I guess all I want to say about this is, I get the concern about maybe making this character, more than emphasizing some aspect or making the character of Galadriel more than she was in the text. But to me, from what I've seen so far, jives with what Tolkien wrote of her when she was younger. And pretty fascinating character. I'm a huge fan of Galadriel, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with this character. So so far, it's kind of like some of the things I see, I'm I'm a little more like I see as problems. Some of the things I see, I'm like, well, some people are calling that a problem. I don't see that as a problem as much. But again, we know very little at this point. So, it's all about evaluating the finished product. It's all about evaluating the things that we actually end up seeing. Um, and I'm just looking forward to being around to make that commentary as it comes. Um, the most important thing to me at the end of the day is just that they respect what Tolkien wrote, what Tolkien himself viewed as the themes of this story, because this was not just something he scratched out and like one of the things he wrote. This was his life's passion. He put his soul into this. He's been very clear about the things that did influence this and the story he was trying to tell. Um, so so that's where I'm coming from when I talk about these Orcish ideologies. It's ideologies that would take what Tolkien wrote and transform it into something that where it's like, well, this is the story we want to tell, right? It's this kind of Melkorish attitude of like, I get to tell the story the way I want to tell it because now I am the Lord of Middle Earth, right? Um, and in some cases, those will go so far as to make a mockery of what Tolkien intended, right? And when that happens, you bet I'm gonna be here, talking about those things and and honestly condemning them. So we'll just have to see. We cross. There's a million different forms that ideological imposition could take. We live in a very ideological age of coming from a lot of different backgrounds. So, I hope this helps clarify that. If it doesn't, well, stay tuned and stay tuned and we'll get there. But that in general, that's what I mean by Orcish ideologies. So hope it helps. Thanks for your questions. Let's keep it civil in the comments. And let's continue to have a good conversation, dive deeper into Tolkien's legendarium, Tolkien's works, the things that make it amazing. And, let's have fun as a fan community learning more about the legendarium and talking about all these issues. So anyway, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and I will talk at you next time, everybody.